And here is the Artist's Almanac for February 22nd, 2018. It's the birthday of American statesman, soldier, and first President of the United States, George Washington. Washington was born in 1732 in Westmoreland County, Colonial Virginia, into a family of prosperous farmers. At 16, he became a surveyor, and a year later he was appointed surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, his first public office. In 1752, he joined the colonial militia. During the French and Indian War, Washington won a reputation for bravery. He then returned to farming at Mount Vernon, a plantation he had inherited from his half-brother. In 1759, he married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow. In the same year, Washington entered the Virginia House of Burgess, where he consistently opposed unfair British taxes, and by 1774 was one of the leading Virginian figures supporting the colonial cause. Washington was sent to Virginia to both the First and Second Continental Congresses in 1774 and 75, and in June of 1775 was appointed commander of all colonial forces. He set about forming the Continental Army and fought with mixed results, but an American victory at Saratoga in October of 1777 prompted the French to agree to an alliance with the Americans. Although Washington's fortunes did not immediately improve, with French military and naval assistance, the tide began to turn, and on October 19th of 1781, the British Army surrendered at Yorktown. In 1787, Washington was elected president of the Constitutional Convention and used his immense influence to persuade the states to ratify the resulting Constitution, and in 1789, Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Washington faced huge challenges in welding together the individual states to establish a new nation and creating a government for that nation. Washington was also dismayed by the emergence of political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, led by his two closest advisors, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, respectively. Washington wanted to retire after his first term, but was re-elected to a second term in 1792, during which he most notably succeeded in maintaining American neutrality when war broke out between Britain and France in 1793, which finally normalized diplomatic relations once again with Britain. That's the short biography of our first president, George Washington. Now, here's a story about George Washington. In early December of 1776, American morale was very low. The Americans had been ousted from New York by the British and their Hessian auxiliaries, and the Continental Army was forced to retreat across New Jersey. 90% of the Continental Army soldiers who had served at Long Island had already deserted, feeling that the cause for independence was lost, and Washington, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, expressed his own doubts, writing to his cousin in Virginia. I think the game is pretty near up. At the time, Trenton, New Jersey, a town with about 100 houses and 2 main streets, was occupied by 4 regiments of Hessian soldiers. The American plan to retake Trenton relied on launching coordinated attacks from 3 directions. On December 20th of 1776, some 2,000 troops led by General Sullivan arrived in Washington's camp. They had been under the command of Charles Lee and had been moving slowly through northern New Jersey when Lee was captured. That same day, an additional 800 troops arrived from Fort Ticonderoga, under the command of Horatio Gates. On Christmas night, Washington endeavored to lead the army across the Delaware. Each soldier carried 60 rounds of ammunition and 3 days' rations. When the army arrived at the shores of the Delaware, they were already behind schedule. Clouds began to form above them, and it began to rain. As the air's temperature dropped, the rain changed to sleet, and then to snow. The Americans began to cross the river in Durham boats, while the horses and artillery went across on large ferries. During the crossing, several men fell overboard. However, no one died during the crossing, and the artillery pieces made it over in good condition. The terrible weather conditions delayed the landings in New Jersey until 3 a.m., 3 hours behind schedule, and ruining Washington's plans for a pre-dawn attack. Another setback occurred for the Americans, as Generals Cadwalader and Ewing, along with their troops, were unable to join the attack due to the weather conditions. Washington was left in New Jersey with half of the troops he'd planned on just the night before. At 4 a.m., the frostbitten and fatigued soldiers began to march towards Trenton. Many of the troops did not have boots, so they were forced to wear rags around their feet. Some of the men's feet bled, turning the snow to a dark red, and 2 of the men died on the march. After marching 1.5 miles into the wind and through winding roads, they reached Jacobs Creek, where with difficulty the Americans made it across and split apart. At 8 a.m., Washington and his troops made first contact, attacking an outpost of Hessian troops 1 mile north of Trenton. Washington himself led the assault, riding in front of his soldiers. Hessian detachments made organized retreats, firing as they fell back to Trenton, where they gained covering fire from other Hessian guard companies on the outskirts of town. By the afternoon, the opposing troops were divided. They had lost their cannon and were fired upon by the Americans from 3 directions. The Hessians' formations broke, and they began to scatter after their commander was mortally wounded. Washington led his troops into the final charge while yelling, "March on, my brave fellows, after me!" Most of the Hessians retreated into an orchard, with the Americans in close pursuit, but were quickly surrounded. The Hessians were offered terms of surrender, to which they agreed. A week later, Washington would once again personally lead his troops at the Battle of Princeton. Washington was only 30 yards from the British lines in Princeton when he ordered his men to fire. When both sides fired, Washington disappeared in the smoke. When the smoke cleared, Washington was unharmed, but the British regulars had broken. Washington then ordered a charge and headed directly toward the British troops, yelling at his own soldiers to rally behind him. The British retreated and fled. Washington's willingness to lead his troops from the front, while shots from British sharpshooters and his own men flew across the battlefield around him, inspired the American forces to hold together throughout the remainder of the war. A young officer who observed Washington in combat at the Battle of Princeton wrote, "I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, with 1,000 deaths flying around him." The sight of his commander-in-chief, he said, set an example of courage such as he had never seen. In contrast, our current president successfully petitioned his exemption from military duty due to bone spurs. It doesn't seem to have hindered his love for golf, however, as he has played a staggering 94 rounds since January 1st of 2018, at a cost of $54 million, a figure which will surely have been augmented by the time you hear this. But don't despair. Donald Trump did, in fact, cancel his Saturday round of golf as a sign of respect to the 17 students and teachers who were murdered last Wednesday in Parkland, Florida, during our nation's deadliest high school shooting to date. The Trumps, however, did manage to visit with first responders and the surviving wounded for a photo op, where Trump gave a broad grin and a thumbs up, somehow managing to look like a third-rate reality TV star at the grand opening of a used car lot. Donald and Melania then headed directly to host a Studio 54-themed disco party at Mar-a-Lago, which fortunately for the host and hostess is just a short 30-minute drive from Parkland. To be fair, it seems that their stop at the hospital did in fact dampen their moods, as it was reported that neither the President nor the First Lady could bear to dance. President George Washington died in Mount Vernon, Virginia on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. Thanks for listening. Be kind, do good work, and until next time.